Can you talk about what you think needs to happen in Syria right now?
Syria is spiraling into real disaster, virtual suicide, and the only sensible approach, the only slim hope for Syria is efforts to reduce the violence and destruction, to establish small regional ceasefire zones, and to move toward some kind of diplomatic settlement. There are steps in that direction. Also, it's necessary to cut off the flow of arms as much as possible to everyone. That means to the vicious and brutal Assad regime, primarily Russia and Iran, to the monstrous ISIS, which has been getting support tacitly through Turkey, through to the al-Nusra Front, which is hardly different, has just the al-Qaeda affiliate technically broke from it, but actually the al-Qaeda affiliate, which is now planning its own, some sort of emirate, getting arms from our allies, Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Our own, the CIA is arming them. We don't know at what level. It's clandestine. As much as possible, cut back the flow of arms, the level of violence, try to save people from destruction. There should be far more support going simply for humanitarian aid of those who are building some sort of a society in Syria, notably the Kurds, should be supported in that effort. These efforts should be made to cut off the flow of jihadis from those places where they're coming from. And that means understanding why it's happening. It's not enough just to say, okay, let's bomb them to oblivion. This is happening for reasons. Some of the reasons, unfortunately, are that we can't reverse. The U.S. invasion of Iraq was a major reason in the development, a primary reason in the incitement of sectarian conflicts, which have now exploded into these monstrosities. That's water under the bridge, unfortunately. Though we can make sure not to do that, not to continue with that. But we may like it or not, but ISIS, the ISIL, whatever you want to call it, does have popular support, even among people who hate it. The Sunni much of the Sunni population of Iraq and Syria evidently regards it as better than the alternative, something which at least defends them from the alternative. From the Western countries, the flow of jihadis is primarily from young people who live in conditions of humiliation, degradation, repression, and want something decent, want some dignity in their lives, want something idealistic. They're picking the wrong horse by a large margin, but you can understand what they're aiming for. And there's plenty of research and studies. Scott Atran, others have worked on this and have plenty of evidence about it. And those conditions, alleviating and dealing with those real problems can be a way to reduce the level of violence and destruction. It's much more dramatic to say, let's carpet bomb them, or let's bomb them to oblivion, or let's send in troops. But that simply makes the situation far worse. Actually, we've seen it for 15 years. Just take a look at the so-called war on terror, which George W. Bush declared, actually redeclared. Reagan had declared it, but redeclared in 2001. At that point, jihadi terrorism was located in a tiny tribal area near the Afghan-Pakistan border. Where is and since then we've been hitting one or another center of what we call terrorism with a sledgehammer. What's happened? Each time it spreads. By now it's all over the world. It's all over Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asia, everywhere you look. Take the bombing of Libya, which Hillary Clinton was strongly in favor of, one of the leaders of, smashed up Libya, destroyed a functioning society. The bombing sharply escalated the level of atrocities by a large factor, devastated the country, left it in the hands of warring militias, opened a door for ISIS to establish a base, spread jihadis and heavy weapons all through Africa, in fact, into the Middle East. Last year, according to UN statistics, the worst terror in the world was in West Africa, Boko Haram and others, to a considerable extent an offshoot of the bombing of Libya. That's what happens when you hit vulnerable systems with a sledgehammer, not knowing what you're doing and not looking at the roots of where these movements are developing from. So you have to understand the situation, understand where it's coming from, where the appeal lies, what the roots are. They're often quite genuine grievances. At the same time, try to cut back the level of violence. And we've had experience where things like this worked. Take, say, IRA terrorism. It was pretty severe. They practically murdered the whole British cabinet at one point. As long as Britain responded to IRA terrorism with more terror and violence, it simply escalated. As soon as Britain finally began, incidentally, with some helpful U.S. assistance at this point, in paying some attention to the actual grievances of Northern Irish Catholics. As soon as they started with that, violence subsided, reduced. People who had been called leading terrorists showed up on negotiating teams, even finally in the government. I happened to be in Belfast in 1993. It was a war zone, literally. I was there again a couple of years ago. It looks like any other city. You can see ethnic antagonisms, but nothing terribly out of the ordinary. That's the way to deal with these issues. Incidentally, what's happening in Syria right now is horrendous, but useful to remember that it's not the first time. If you go back a century, almost exactly a century, at the end of the First World War, there were hundreds of thousands of people starving to death in Syria. Proportional to the population, it's likely that more Syrians died in the First World War than any other belligerent. Syria did revive, and it can revive again.
What about Saudi Arabia, both in the context of Syria, the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia, and how much control Saudi Arabia has over this situation, not to mention what's happening right now in Yemen, the U.S.-supported Saudi strikes in Yemen. But start with Syria.
Well, there's a long history of the basic. We don't have a lot of time, but the basic story is that the United States, like Britain before it, has tended to support radical Islamism against secular nationalism. That's been a consistent theme of imperial strategy for a long time. Saudi Arabia is the center of radical Islamic extremism. Patrick Coburn, one of the best commentators, most knowledgeable commentators, has correctly pointed out that what he calls the Wahhabization of Sunni Islam, the spread of Saudi extremist Wahhabi doctrine over Sunni Islam, the Sunni world, is one of the real disasters of the modern era. It's a source of not only funding for extremist radical Islam and the jihadi outgrowths of it, but also doctrinally, mosques, clerics, and so on, schools, madrasas where you study just Quran, is spreading all over the huge Sunni areas from Saudi influence, and it continues. Saudi Arabia itself has one of the most grotesque human rights records in the world, of the ISIS beheadings, which shock everyone. I think Saudi Arabia is the only country where you have regular beheadings. It's the least of it. Women can't drive, so on and so forth. And it is strongly backed by the United States and its allies, Britain and France. The reason, it's got a lot of oil, it's got a lot of money, you can sell them a lot of arms, I think tens of billions of dollars of arms. And the actions that it's carrying out, for example, in Yemen, which you mentioned, are causing an immense a humanitarian catastrophe in a pretty poor country, also stimulating jihadi terrorism, naturally, with U.S. and also British arms. The French are trying to get into it as well. This is a very ugly story. Saudi Arabia itself is, you know, its economy is based not only on a wasting resource, but a resource which is destroying the world. There's reports now that it's trying to take some steps, to much belated steps, should have been 50 years ago, to try to diversify the economy. It does have resources that are not destructive, like sunlight, for example, which could be used and is to an extent being used for solar power. But it's way too late and probably can't be done. But it has been a serious source of major global problems, horrible society in itself in many ways, and the U.S. and its allies and Britain before it have stimulated these radical Islamist developments throughout the Islamic world for a long time.
Do you think Obama has dealt